Reports suggest that Ukrainian forces have recaptured territory in the south of their country. It's their biggest breakthrough there since the start of the war. Russian installed officials have acknowledged Ukraine's advances in the Kherson region. That's one of 4 that Russia illegally annexed last week. Photos shared on social media appear to show soldiers raising the Ukrainian flag in several villages. Unverified reports suggest Ukrainian troops have advanced as much as 40 kilometers in a single day. And let's get more right now from DW correspondent Nick Connolly, who is in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Nick, very good to see you this evening. What can you tell us about these latest advances?
Well, it does seem like after months where there was a lot of talk about Kherson and where this always basically turned out to be a kind of distraction tactic when actually Ukraine was making its advances in the east near Kharkiv and basically just doing some incremental movements in Kherson, that this is now really getting going. Ukrainian forces not only heading towards Kherson from the west, but also from the north, and the Russians are really exposed there. They are on the west bank of the Dnipro River. This is a really, really wide river that is at its widest at that point, and Ukraine's been able to basically destroy all the crossings, and now Russia is dependent on pontoon bridges and air transit to get supplies to that garrison there, so they're very, very vulnerable. And there's a sense that Ukraine is now really reaping the rewards of months of fairly kind of low-level and kind of methodical work at trying to just destroy Russian supply lines, Russian arms depots, and now those Russian soldiers are really suffering from basically kind of starvation of ammunition. They're really having to think 3 times about using all kinds of weapon systems and not really able to respond in kind to the kind of barrage they're coming up against from the Ukrainians now moving in towards Kherson.
Now, this all sounds very impressive, but there has no doubt been heavy costs in terms of both human life and material for the Ukrainian forces. What can you tell us about those losses, and what might that mean for their advance?
Well, that's the thing. The Ukrainian military keeps a very tight lid on all these kinds of stats, even in terms of lives lost earlier on in the conflict, let alone material and kind of weapons systems. I think the important thing to bear in mind, though, is that it does seem like those Western weapons deliveries are getting here in time and increasingly in larger volumes on shorter time frames than was the big case at the beginning of the war. And we're seeing that those HIMARS systems, those rocket artillery systems that have been so crucial to Ukraine's ability to destroy Russian logistics behind the front lines, they are still operating. The Russian media has covered supposedly stories about the destruction of these systems time and time again, but we see that they are still operating, that those stories are not true. And in terms of boots on the ground, there is no shortage in this country of people willing to fight. You'll remember those pictures from the early days of the war when you had huge queues outside of the military recruiting offices, and that is still largely the case. What Ukraine needs are weapons and more complex weapon systems, missile systems that can reach targets further away from their positions. But in terms of the kind of equipment on the level and the kind of complexity they have so far, it doesn't seem like they are currently in a difficult situation.
Now, that's everything on the conventional side of the war, but the shadow of the Russian nuclear threat is, of course, ever present. How seriously are people where you are taking that?
I think for the longest time this was kind of not taken seriously. It was deemed to be just a kind of empty threat coming from Russia, an attempt to kind of up the stakes rhetorically in a kind of time where we're seeing Russian conventional forces lose time and time again on the battlefield, an attempt to maybe scare less the Ukrainians who are already dealing with Russia, but maybe the European countries that are sending supplies towards Ukraine. And people were just discounting this for the most part. I think one thing that has made people think have been statements in recent days by retired top US generals, Petraeus, we heard from Ben Hodges. They were basically kind of giving some detail on what they would expect the US response to be if nuclear weapons were used. They were very clear to say they were speaking in a personal capacity, that they hadn't been told to do so. But the fact that we've seen these 2 generals say fairly kind of similar things and give quite a lot of detail has raised questions here in Kiev whether there is a kind of signal being sent to Moscow indirectly via these retired figures. And you have had reports of people here trying to find out what to do if nuclear weapons are used, what kind of strategies to employ, what kind of iodine tablets or other kind of measures could help. So there is a sense that this is a real possibility, but it's not changing behaviour. There's no sense that Ukraine is now suddenly thinking about coming to the table and kind of giving in to Russian demands to avoid this. But it is definitely something that is kind of forefront in people's minds right now at a time where things are really not looking good for Vladimir Putin.
We'll have more on that response to the nuclear threats later, but for now, we'll leave it there with you, DW correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Thanks very much. Ukrainian forces are also pushing on with their counteroffensive in northeastern Ukraine. Yet as Russian forces withdraw from that region, evidence is emerging of what was a brutal occupation.
Ivan is not coming back. Months after he disappeared, his mother is still trying to figure out what happened.
He went to the forest with his friend to pick up pine cones to light the samovar, to make tea. And I never saw him again.
She believes Ivan was tortured in the basement of this house. Neighbors identified his body by the jacket he wore from the local grain factory where he worked.
He had this photo with him of us when he was a boy.
The town of Izium was among the first taken by Russian forces after the war started, and it became a command center for them. They set up at least 10 torture sites. Andrei Kotsar was captured shortly after joining the Ukrainian army. Once his captors let him go, he sought shelter at a nearby monastery.
They beat me only where my kidneys and liver are, rather than directly in my face. And they beat the hell out of my back. But they tried not to leave any scars.
Most of Izium has been destroyed. The city is without electricity, gas or water. Many families rely upon humanitarian aid to get by.
We're here to get clothes for our children and food. That's what we need.
But despite the difficulties after months of terror under occupation, life seems to be slowly returning to the city.